Hello, my name is Kai Chan, and I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability, and founder of Cosphere, a community of small planet heroes. And I'm in here in the studio with Claire again.
Great to be back. As you have heard, I'm a master's student in Kai's lab, and I think about urban soundscapes and relationships to nature, but that's old news if you've met me before.
Today, we're so excited to have Dr. David Boyd as our guest. He's cross-appointed as a professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability, my home department, as well as the School for Public Policy and Global Affairs. He's a leading expert on environmental law and policy and internationally renowned about the relationship between human rights and environmental degradation.
He's also the award-winning author of over 100 articles and 8 books. His most recent, The Optimistic Environmentalist, Progress Towards a Greener Future.
A book I have in my travel bag. He has an unusual path. He came to his professorial appointment after being one of Canada's leading environmental lawyers, working with and then leading as the executive director the Sierra Legal Defense Fund, which is now called EcoJustice.
And he's been active at pretty much every jurisdictional scale, starting down at the bottom with the City of Vancouver's Greenest City Action Team. After that, he did a 12-month stint in Canada's Privy Council office.
Before that, actually.
Oh, before that. Oh my gosh, long timeline. In Canada's Privy Council office, and 6 years as a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, which was from 2018 to 2024.
And he's had some big impacts in those roles, along with a series of interventions in different nations around the world. With country visits in that role as the UN Special Rapporteur, he also helped, along with civil society, youth activists, women and Indigenous people that he was working with. He managed to have the UN General Assembly acknowledge the human right to a healthy environment for all people in the world. That was in 2022, which meant that his successor had a different title. Instead of being the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment, it was the Special Rapporteur for a human right to a healthy environment. I got that right, David?
You banged it on.
Awesome. Welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
We are too.
If there's a pit in your stomach from the way that we live, you'll want it to change, something's going to give. Well, we've got stories that'll give us a glimpse of better ways, reconnect everything. We're small planet heroes, small planet heroes.
I just wanted to say, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't also mention that David is an accomplished regional athlete. And he's notoriously known as the reigning champion of Pender Island's Barnacle Man Triathlon, a big feather in his cap.
I've got to do that one with you, David, someday. So let's start with your unusual trajectory. We have been asking a bunch of our guests which came first, explaining their small planet hero journey, their purpose or their science. And in your case, it's pretty clear that your purpose for your science came before the science itself, because you already had that established and impactful career as an environmental lawyer before you came back in 1990-something to do your PhD. But can you give us a bit of a picture of your journey? So your business degree at the University of Alberta and a JD, and then the career, and then coming back for a PhD. Tell us a bit about that and as to why at each turn.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that I fell in love with nature as a little boy, living in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to have this lifelong relationship with the natural world and to put my education to use in protecting nature. So after law school, the only field of law that I was interested in practicing was environmental law. And then, it was 1992. There was a big year for the planet in terms of the biggest Earth Summit and new international conventions on climate change and biodiversity and desertification. And just fortuitously, and this is probably going to be a theme of the conversation, fortuitously, there was this new organization just starting up out in Vancouver called the Sierra Legal Defense Fund, which was using the law to sue governments and businesses that were violating the law. And so I got on a Greyhound bus and came out to Vancouver and started litigating. And that was certainly the most fun I'd had in a professional legal sense. So that was the starting point, really.
Yeah, but what after, because you would have been executive director when you decided to come back and do a PhD, right?
No, there's another gap in there. So
Okay.
I left the Sierra Legal Defense Fund in 1998, disillusioned with the Canadian environmental legal system. Sierra Legal Defense Fund had been patterned after a sister organization in the United States, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which had decades of huge victories protecting endangered species and stopping terrible industrial projects from happening. And the reality is that as I learned over a period of years, the American environmental law system is completely different from the Canadian system, and litigation is a much less effective tool in Canada because of those systemic differences. So I shifted gears and I wrote my first book about the fundamental flaws of the Canadian legal system when it comes to protecting nature. And that took several years. I worked as a research associate at the University of Victoria, did some pro bono work for the David Suzuki Foundation, also did some work for the Haida Nation. And that led me to, it was a funny story. So I wrote this very long, very heavily footnoted book called Unnatural Law, which
Book that we have read and love and that is still recognized as the most important book about Canadian environmental law and policy.
Yeah, so I asked David Suzuki to do one of those 2-sentence blurbs for the back of the book, and he did very generously. But he also, once he'd read the book, he was like, this is a great book, but nobody's going to read it. So you need to do like a short, punchy version of it. And so I wrote a sort of summary of the prescription part of the book called Sustainability Within a Generation for the David Suzuki Foundation. Then David gave that book to Paul Martin on one of his visits to Ottawa, and Paul Martin then phoned me up and said, will you come to Ottawa and help us turn this great vision into a reality? So so I ended up spending a year in the Privy Council office, and it was when Paul Martin's government fell that I came back to school to do a PhD.
When you left that space, were you feeling more optimistic or disillusioned? Because at these turns, you were a cowboy of environmental law. You got on your Greyhound. You came out here. You maybe felt a little worse about how it could all work out. Were you fueled by a vision of better opportunity or by disgruntlement and, disillusionment?
Oh, you mean when I went back to school?
Yeah.
Oh, I was like really thought I had worked at the national level. I had worked at the provincial level. And at that time, we had governments hostile to the environment, both nationally and provincially. And so I was like, well, why not do a PhD and like dive into something that I'm really interested in? And also I had some experience teaching at Simon Fraser University, loved it. And so it seemed like a great opportunity to take a break from the real world.
So I thought you were already in the PhD program when you went to serve in the Privy Council office. Because when you and I met, I was interviewing for my current job back in 2005, I guess, early 2005. And I thought you were already in the program, but you were in Ottawa, I thought.
I started the program in 2004, I think, and then I went to Ottawa like soon thereafter.
Right. Got it. One of the things that I've loved about you, David, over the years, and one of the reasons that I think you and I kept up is because I could tell that you think about things differently than many of my colleagues, right? Where, I don't know, I'm going to call you a revolutionary. You're like, and I mean that in the best sense. We could call you a small planet hero. Claire called you a cowboy. We got lots of terms that we could use here, but you're not afraid to call the crap, right? To call out bad behavior, to imagine something radically different and to work towards that. And I think that's pretty rare. From my experience, that's pretty rare in academia, where people are actually that focused on a big goal and willing to do all kinds of things to achieve that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. I'm not sure that I would describe myself that way. I mean, one of the things about being a lawyer is that you're in service to your clients, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's been part of the great experiences that I've had over all of these years has been working for other people to try and use my ability to support them and to lift them up. I love that about being the special rapporteur, that I really felt like I was there to amplify people's voices. And so, yeah, revolutionary. I think there's a lot of revolutionaries in the world and they need a helping hand.
Mm-hmm. So you see your role then as being more rooted in that science, but helping.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that I've always tried to be is reflective about whether the things that I'm doing in the moment are the most transformative possible things. And so litigation seemed exciting at the beginning, but reflecting on that, evaluating its impact, I realized it was time to try something different. Then I worked trying to strengthen Canadian laws and had some successes. Canada's first Species at Risk Act, changes to the federal pesticide regulations. But really, it was the PhD experience that kind of catalyzed for me an idea that could really seriously have transformative impacts in terms of protecting nature and protecting people. And so I can't really claim that was part of a grand strategy. It was another one of those serendipitous moments. And in fact, a series of serendipitous moments. I had seen a Filipino lawyer at a conference back in 1994 talking about this amazing case that he brought on behalf of his children and future generations, arguing that the logging of old-growth forests in the Philippines violated their constitutional right to a healthy environment. And it was a total David and Goliath case, which he succeeded in beyond his wildest dreams at the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And that case led to an absolute stop to logging of old-growth forests in the Philippines. And that the seed of that idea was planted in me. In Canada, we don't have a constitutional right to a healthy environment. So as a practicing lawyer, it didn't make a difference. But then when I had the opportunity to go do a PhD, I thought, I wonder how many other countries are doing this and how big of a difference does it make?
I come from a generation of people who I think feel very uncertain of the ability of our institutions to govern themselves in such a way that is actually useful to the environment and people. And as a lawyer, you, in essence, you embody the law. You are the law walking, and you interpret it in a way that is beneficial to your client and maybe to your value system. Have you always believed in the ability of the law to transform accordingly to the vision of the people? Because I think you will have heard the kind of modern youth revolutionary cries, tear it all down, that we can't amend these things to serve us in the way that we require them to. Have you questioned your own belief in the law at times and its ability to reform?
Yeah, for sure. I think that question is something that's with me all of the time, but I have a deep, I would say, in my heart, I believe what Martin Luther King said, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I really like, if there's anything that ever since I was like a teenager infuriates me, it's all forms of injustice, and whether that's between people or between people and nature. And so like that visceral aversion to injustice, I mean, tear it all down. I think that there's part of me that's attracted to that, but there's also a part of me that's more pragmatic and worries that if we tore it all down, we'd actually be in a worse place than we are today.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are places where they didn't tear it all down, where they changed their institutions, they changed their constitutions, and they have transformed their societies in ways that have benefited people and benefited nature, I find that profoundly inspiring. And that's why I feel like, again, like so fortunate to have kind of stumbled into this field at a time when it's so absolutely fundamental to, that we do make these systemic and transformative changes.
Yeah. So then the PhD for you was recognizing the limitations of Canadian environmental law, then to look elsewhere and to study that systemically, to see what is being done elsewhere and what are the effects of that. And so that's where the science comes in a way that illuminates and allows for a broader set of possibilities within a nation that might otherwise have reached its limits effectively, more or less. I'm curious, when I entered, you might remember this, but when I took this job, I had a long series of conversations with everybody that I talked to. It got to the point where it was so annoying for the folks who were thinking about hiring me that like they had to call by postdoc supervisor, Gretchen Daly, and find out whether I was really serious about coming to the university. But I wanted to know from everybody where I could be most impactful. And I was worried. I was really worried because my father had been a professor and I'd seen how the institutions had shaped him and his work. I was worried about it undermining my pursuit of what I really most believed in. And I wonder, you've been in this role now for a few years. I mean, during which you've done a lot of other things, partly outside the university, like that role at the UN. But do you feel like the institution is softening you in a sense, is eroding some of that kind of pursuit of justice, or is it just elevating?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, being a professor is a gift, right? I mean, you're surrounded by brilliant people. You're surrounded by young, brilliant people who provide motivation and inspiration, and you have such complete freedom. I mean, it really is an extraordinary luxury to be serving as a professor.
Yeah, that's why I'm still here too. In this season, we're pivoting entirely around the idea of system change or transformative change and the role of science within it. In so many of these conversations, this idea of system change is so diffuse and amorphous. And one of the things that we are excited about is to see with you where system change can be pinned down to concrete changes in the law that can have ripple effects on the rest of the system. Would you say that the law does have that transformative potential?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think back to the abolition of slavery, that was driven by lawyers using human rights to advance the cause of slaves. You know, one of the most horrific institutions of human history was dismantled by activists using the law, and in particular, the human rights branch of the law. If you think about the emancipation of women, I mean, we have come so far in terms of advance. We're not, and I think this is another really important point. People talk about systems change like you can snap your fingers. That's just not the way it works. It's a decadal, even centuries-long process, and it requires some degree of patience that for many of us is really difficult. But I take inspiration from Haida elders who I met when I was working with the Haida, and I was so impatient. I wanted them to bring a lawsuit right away to sue the government to assert their title because they have such a strong case to Aboriginal title. And I'll never forget a Haida elder saying to me, "David, you need to relax. We've been working on this for over 150 years, and we're going to get to where we need to be." And it's stuck with me because the Haida have achieved transformative change, right? They have, the provincial government just this year recognized that over 150 years of Canadian history were wrong, that land never was provincial land, that land has always been Haida land. What the Haida described the Haida Gwaii as the area briefly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. It's just such a lovely way to describe it. And so that patience, I think, is really important.
If I may push back a little on what you just said, I think part of the general anxiety about the climate and ecological crisis is there is not time. That's what we've been told, and I think that's what we're seeing with, island nations disappearing under the ocean and people's homes being swallowed more quickly than we can understand even the science behind them. The baselines are shifting fast, and it seems like there's not enough dynamic change happening to meet the rate of change. What do you tell the climate anxious people who maybe would like to believe in the long, slow arc of history, but don't feel like there's enough time for it to play out?
Well, first of all, I would agree with them about the urgency of the crisis. And I would also say that many of those people who are anxious about the climate crisis are on the front lines of pushing governments and businesses to move faster. We just experienced a 2-week hearing at the Hague at the International Court of Justice in a case that was catalyzed, driven forward by young people, and really could be the most important legal proceeding in human history if the International Court of Justice lays down the law as it should and puts forth an advisory opinion that clarifies states' obligation to move faster and to provide much higher volumes of climate finance. And then I would also say, from my background as an optimistic environmentalist, sometimes it's hard to see the progress when you're living in it. And we are living in a period of transformative change. Our energy systems are changing dramatically before our very eyes. Like if you And the best example of this I can give is the growth of solar-powered electricity generation, right? Which in the year 2000, there was 1 gigawatt of installed solar electricity generating capacity. But that has been growing exponentially. And that means it's growing faster than our brains actually can comprehend. So it's doubling every 2 years. And so, the International Energy Agency, which is the world's leading energy forecasting organization, back in 2000, when we had 1 gigawatt, they thought, well, if governments put the right policies in place and if businesses invest, we could get to 7 by the year 2020.
Mhm.
Well, we blew past 7, and we're now adding more than 7 gigawatts almost on a weekly basis, right? And so, it's 2024. If solar continues to double every 2 years, as it has for 24 years, then in the early 2030s, solar will displace coal as the leading source of electricity generation globally. So that's fast progress. Do we need to move faster? Absolutely. We need to start really focusing our attention on the criminals that are continuing to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry and their co-collaborators in government. And that's a tall order because it's the most powerful industry on earth.
Mhm.
Let's take a step back and go back through your career. And what we want to hear here is a little bit about your experience working at these different scales and in these different ways. A little bit about what worked and what doesn't, what the opportunities are, where the barriers are. So working up from the smallest scales, thinking about the Greenest City Action Team. You co-started that Greenest City Action Team with Mayor Gregor Robertson and led it for years. Tell us a bit about how that worked and what you were able to accomplish with that, and then also, where you got stuck or where it didn't proceed further.
Yeah, first of all, credit to Gregor Robertson, who had this really powerful vision. And we had an argument at the outset about whether it should be the greenest city. His goal was to be the greenest city in the world. I was like, how about the greenest city in North America, which seemed a lot more realistic. But he was the mayor, so you got to decide being a city in the world. And I think that, with the advantage of hindsight, there were things we could have done differently. But it was a vision that actually resulted in some substantial changes in the city of Vancouver, and also served as a catalyst for kind of a global competition among cities to try and capture that title. So I think it was overall successful, but we ran into some pretty serious barriers along the way, and I'll just mention 2 of them briefly. The first was that as an institution, the city of Vancouver, there were people in the city organization who didn't agree with the vision of the greenest city. And so, which was really striking to me. I'll never forget having a conversation with the head of the department that was tasked with water management. And one of our kind of main proposals was to have everybody on a water meter to measure, so that, because at that time, very few households in Vancouver were on water meters. So you had like a wealthy family and people were paying a flat rate for water. So like if you had a swimming pool at your house in Point Grey, you're paying the same as somebody in East Vancouver who's like, very carefully monitoring their low flow shower and their low flow toilet, which is just, again, getting back to injustice.
Mm-hmm.
But this bureaucrat was like, well, we don't need to have water meters because it rains a lot here. We have these North Shore reservoirs. Like, what's the point?
Mhm.
And it was just like this clash of, it was like this clash of worldviews. And eventually there were a bunch of senior civil servants that had to be replaced so that we could move forward with that agenda.
Mhm.
The other major barrier was that at that time in 2009 to 2011, we had a federal government and a provincial government that were basically anti-environmental. And so cities in Canada and in many countries in the world have very limited financial resources and very limited legal powers. And so we were just kind of blocked at every turn when it came to transforming the transportation system, for example. Like, Metro Vancouver controls TransLink and the province controls TransLink. And so there was, despite our ambitions to transform transportation, the best we could do is a few bike lanes and lobbying for a Canada line along the Broadway corridor.
Yeah.
So that was frustrating.
Mhm. The frustrations that emerge at the municipal level from having worked for the city of Vancouver and discussed with people at different levels of governance are somewhat unique. Municipalities are faced with very unique budget concerns and then also obligations to its citizens. If we float one level higher to the province and even the feds, if it's easier to talk about both at once, what of those can you avoid, and what level of granularity do we miss when we get higher, one step further away from citizens in that way?
Can we just spend one more minute on the city of Vancouver?
Yeah.
I think it's really important to say that when you have whatever level you're talking about, there's always opportunities, and you have to like really do your homework so you know those opportunities. So, for example, the city of Vancouver, uniquely in British Columbia and I think in Canada, the city of Vancouver has its own building code. So we're not governed by the provincial building code. So and this connects to the science actually. So the province and the federal government are developing more energy efficient building codes for new buildings, but there's a huge problem with all of the existing building stock, right? And a graduate student at the Institute for Resources and Environment and Sustainability did their research on how many people, when they're doing a home renovation, are not just putting in a fancy new kitchen or, making the bathroom look glossier. They're also doing energy efficiency upgrades. And the shocking answer, despite the availability of like literally thousands of dollars in incentives, was 4%.
Well,
So at the city of Vancouver, realizing we had our own power to control the building code, one of the most effective things we did in that project was say that if you're doing a renovation of any type in the city of Vancouver to your home, you have to at the same time do an energy efficient upgrade. And the bigger your renovation, the more boxes on the list of things for energy efficiency upgrades you have to do. And the fear of the politicians was, there'll be a big backlash because we're telling people they have to do stuff. But in fact, all of these energy efficiency upgrades also make your home more comfortable. And so there was never a squeak of opposition to this, despite it being a fairly radical step forward.
Let's talk a little bit about the federal and or provincial scales. And I know you've had so many different engagements at that scale, from your involvement with the plastic bans. I think you were also involved in the SEPA provision of a right to a healthy environment. Is that right?
Oh yes, worked on that for many years.
Yeah.
SEPA being the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Exactly. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What you think of the provision for a right to a healthy environment in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and so what it does right and also where it falls short?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, based on the research that I did when I was doing my PhD here at UBC, what I learned was that a constitutional right to a healthy environment is an incredibly powerful lever for change. And so I actually wrote a book I was so excited about what I found about the way this right has been used internationally that I wrote a book about how powerful it would be in the Canadian context, and was shocked to learn that back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were Canadians who campaigned for that when Pierre Trudeau said we need our own constitution. He put together a joint House of Commons Senate committee that traveled across Canada by train, listening to Canadians about what they thought should be in the new constitution. And there were these amazing testimonies by people saying a right to a healthy environment should be in the constitution. Obviously that didn't happen. And so the amendment to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to recognize that Canadians have the right to a healthy environment, I think it's important symbolically. Canada joining the majority of the world's nations that do recognize this fundamental human right. It's much, much weaker than a constitutional right to a healthy environment. So if you're optimistic, we can look at it as a step on that journey towards putting that into Canada's constitution. But it is not a very strong provision from a legal perspective.
Because it doesn't stipulate particular things that the government must do, and also doesn't provide a legal basis for individuals to sue either the government or companies. Is that right?
It may provide additional strength to lawsuits that are being brought by individuals against the government, not against companies. And it's also, if there was a constitutional right to a healthy environment, it would apply not only to the federal government, but to provincial and municipal governments. The right to a healthy environment, the way it's recognized in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, unfortunately, only applies within the parameters of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So it doesn't even apply to things like national parks or pesticides,
Right.
or other issues. So it is quite a narrow provision.
Yeah.
And we fought. I mean, we fought to have it stronger, and there's just, it was, to be honest, it's somewhat of a miracle that we were able to get it into the Canadian Environmental Protection Act at all, because there was strong opposition from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
While we're on Canada, before we get even more meta, even higher scale, I think we're looking at a wave of conservatism, certainly in North America, probably more broadly than that. And you spoke earlier about how during your PhD, you sort of took a step back from when the government wasn't advantageous to do some of the work that you were trying to do. It's possible that that's incoming. And what is this time used best as? Is it a beat? Is it everybody, have a meeting and figure out what we do next? Should we all go get PhDs? Since it's true, this is happening, and it's probably the case that more governments will be less amenable to radical changes, constitutionally or otherwise. How do we think about making change when it's not advantageous to do so?
Well, I think, first of all, recognizing that what you describe as a wave, I would describe as a pendulum that swings back and forth from progressive to conservative. And, Kai and I have been around longer than you have, Claire, but I can remember having a similar conversation when George Bush was elected president of the United States. And so I think that my answer is twofold. One is that we need to oppose the worst of the changes that these regressive forces are trying to bring in. And the other is to prepare ourselves for the time when the window and the door is once again open. Mm-hmm. And then also to recognize that while there may be forces of darkness here in this country and there in that country, there's always going to be forces of light that are in power in other places. So now maybe is a time to focus on local governments. Now maybe is a time for Canadians to support governments in the global south and allies in the global south that are working on issues there. And I think that's one of the things where we could really use some greater reflection, is to acknowledge the fact that sometimes our energy and resources that we apply to issues in Canada would be better focused on supporting like-minded people in other places whose problems we are actually contributing to or exacerbating.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a good moment to switch to thinking about your role as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to a Healthy Environment. Or did you ever get that title? Good. Okay.
Yeah, for the last few months of my mandate, I had to call myself the world's first Special Rapporteur on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment.
Nice. So that must have been a wonderful experience for you, being equipped with a PhD that covered how many different nations?
92.
92. To then be able to use that body of work and then new research, which you seem to be able to fit all of into your head, and then to be able to pull out whenever it's needed in a way that, with a kind of encyclopedic knowledge that I think most of us can only aspire to. But then to put that to work, right? In finding those moments and points of opportunity where the law could be changed or enforced better to result in greater justice. Tell us a bit about how that worked.
Yeah, this is like probably the final episode of Serendipity. I mean, I really, through no vision of my own, ended up being the right person in the right place at the right time. I have colleagues who had been working for literally 30 years trying to get the United Nations to recognize the right to a healthy environment. And when I held my first consultation with a group of really smart people in New York in the fall of 2018, they said, look, it's just not going to happen. Come up with some different priorities. And I just didn't think they were right. And I started a coalition of civil society organizations with a group of 10 people, and they, to their credit, grew that organization into a network of over 1,400 organizations, started a children's environmental rights initiative. Again, small meeting in the basement of a hotel in Belgium with 6 people. That turned into a global alliance of children's organizations that organized a petition that hundreds of thousands of children signed, demanding that the United Nations recognize their right to a healthy environment. And then just working with a handful of states that were sympathetic to this idea Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland. This core group that has supported the mandate of the Special Rapporteur at the Human Rights Council. And frankly, we just overcame the odds through sheer determination. And it was definitely the highlight of my professional career. It was just an amazing start to finish experience.
Can you also tell us about, so that is amazing, by the way. And we celebrated it when we heard. It's just like such an amazing achievement, and so great to have been involved. You also took a lot of pride, I know, out of your work with the various nations when you did those country visits. Can you tell us a little bit about how those visits would work and the kinds of opportunities that you were able to realize through those visits?
Yeah, so country visits is one of the most important tasks that a special rapporteur has. And because of limited resources, you can only do 2 country visits every year. But what you do is you identify countries you want to go to for various reasons. I went to Fiji first because I wanted to visit a small island developing state and see for myself the impacts of the climate crisis, talk to the people experiencing that on the ground. And that was a life-changing experience. I visited a place called Vunidogoloa, one of the first communities on Earth that had to completely relocate because of climate change. And, this was a community that was basically, if you close your eyes and imagine a tropical paradise, palm trees, beaches, and it became unlivable because of rising sea levels, storm surges, saltwater contamination of their drinking water supply and their agricultural lands. And Fiji is a fortunate small island state in that they have lots of land and higher elevation land. So this particular community just moved inland by about 3 kilometers. So I visited their new village site as well, and we actually walked down from the new village site to the old village site. But it's a steep and tricky trail. It's blazing hot. It's really humid. And so for people in the new village who are older persons, young children, pregnant women, people with disabilities, they're literally cut off from the ocean that has been the beating heart of their culture and their economy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so that was a really striking experience. So that's just one example of the kind of impact these country visits have. But the thing for me that I realized on that trip to Fiji, and which stayed with me throughout my entire time, was the value of getting feet on the ground and talking to people who have this lived experience. I mean, I was only in Fiji or any other country visit for 2 weeks, and I would literally have 30 or 40 or 50 meetings with ministers, with judges, with civil society organizations, with grassroots activists, visit as many places as humanly possible during that 2-week time, and then, crazily enough, write a report that would be released on the last day of the visit with recommendations to the government as to what they should do. And so it's an extremely intense experience. But then months after that, you prepare a more formal document, which is submitted to the Human Rights Council, and the governments respond to that at the next meeting of the council. So it means that there's an impetus on them to actually do something to respond to your recommendations, which is why it's a powerful tool.
And so you know very well about some of the progress that came out of those visits and your recommendations.
Yeah, and so for me, that was the kind of beautiful complement to the achievement of the UN recognition of the right, which is like historic and exciting and inspiring, but it's just words on paper at the end of the day. And for me, what was really important about that was to see it translated into changes on the ground. So I went to Botswana on a country visit in 2023, and a couple of things about that. One is I visited an Indigenous community in the Kalahari Desert that with about 1,500 people, and I hosted a community meeting there, listened to people telling me about life in the climate crisis in Botswana. And, they kind of joked. They said, look, we know we live in the Kalahari Desert. It's always been hot. It's always been dry. But the heat now is like nothing we've ever experienced. And it's making it impossible to grow food. It's making it really difficult to get water. And it's also causing problems with wildlife that are experiencing the same challenges that we're experiencing. And this particular Indigenous community, as I said, 1,500 people. When I was there, it was about 45 degrees in the shade, and I saw a lineup of women and girls with, buckets and jerry cans, waiting for their chance to get to one of the community's 2 boreholes to get water for their homes. And so in my interim report to the government, I said, look, this is completely unacceptable. Botswana is a middle-income country because of diamond wealth. These people need to have access to safe and sufficient water as part of their right to a healthy environment. And between that interim report and the submission of the formal report to the Human Rights Council, the government of Botswana drilled 4 more wells in that community, which, you know, as Canadians, we take water for granted, most of us. But for the people in that community, I'm just so happy that they are fundamentally better off because of that. Similarly, in Chile, Chile was a country I went to because I had learned about this horrific phrase called zonas de sacrificio, or sacrifice zones, where human health, human rights, and the environment are being basically sacrificed at the altar of corporate greed. And again, visited some of these so-called sacrifice zones in Chile, including one of the most notorious in the world, Quintero Puchuncaví, where there's all of these industrial facilities, petrochemical plants, coal-fired power plants, smelters. And to the government of Chile's credit, they are making an absolutely amazing effort to clean up and restore life in these sacrifice zones. So they have closed down 8 coal-fired power plants in Chile. They have, in that particular community, they closed down an antiquated metal smelter. They brought in new standards for things like arsenic in soil. They're strengthening air quality standards. And I have to tip my hat to them for, you know, after decades of just complete disregard for the people of Quintero Puchuncaví, the current government of Chile is trying to make amends.
It's amazing. It's amazing what's possible when you have a government that is willing to listen and look and try, right?
Now that we've gotten UNDRIP and things like 30 by 30, the Canadian right to a healthy environment, how do those things translate into something that is useful to communities?
Yeah, that's a big question, Claire.
So sorry.
No, that's okay. Big questions are good. I mean, I think that big questions need big answers. So yes, I think the right to a healthy environment, if we look around the world, the beauty of it is we have this world with 200 countries. So we can actually, and I think we could do a better job of this. We could look at the countries that are doing good things and ask ourselves, how is it they're able to do those good things? And identify the traits and the factors that led a country like Costa Rica, for example, that 40 years ago was an environmental disaster. Deforestation had reduced forest cover in Costa Rica to less than 25%. They changed their constitution in the early 1990s to recognize the right to a healthy environment. And it was one of those pivotal moments. And they've had a few in Costa Rica. They got rid of the military in the around 1950 and plowed all that money they saved from militarization into healthcare and education, with the result that they rapidly caught up and surpassed the United States in metrics like life expectancy and literacy. But when they added the right to a healthy environment to their constitution, it just turned things around. It was a move that was consistent with who the people were of Costa Rica, but it aligned the culture with the law and the government in ways that have enabled them to catapult forward. So they've now had incredible reforestation programs. They're now over 50% forest cover. They generate almost all of their electricity with renewables. And I could go on and on about that kind of Costa Rican miracle. But Slovenia is another example. Slovenia, one of the first countries in the world to put the right to a healthy environment in its constitution back in the early 1970s. And when Slovenia joined the EU, they were, as an Eastern European country, quite a ways behind Western Europe. But they really took advantage of EU funding, basically, and have rocketed past. They're now number 2 in the EU in recycling, and they take it very seriously. They have an ethic. So I think it goes beyond the law, for sure, to culture as well. And when you think about it in those terms, then it opens up fields of possibility. I mean, I think, we need leaders can make a big difference. And yeah, that's the thing. Also, when you were talking about these changes, I thought about the Sustainable Development Goals. And one thing it's nothing to do with the law, but another catalytic thing that we can do to move towards a more just and sustainable future is empowering women and girls. And the evidence, both empirical and anecdotal, about the improvements you get when you have more women in positions of power. I'll never forget being at the conference of the parties to the climate convention in Dubai last year. I was on a panel with the Prime Minister of Estonia and the Prime Minister of Estonia and Slovenia. And these two women, and the Prime Minister of Iceland. And these three women were about as progressive on climate action, human rights, and the environment as Greenpeace or anybody. They totally got it. But then when you saw a picture of world leaders from that conference, there were about 12 women out of 150. And I thought to myself, if there was gender balance here, we would be light years ahead in tackling the climate crisis and a number of other pressing social issues. So, that's not anything to do with the right to a healthy environment. That's just something that we need to do globally as a species to move forward.
Mm-hmm. You've just come back from The Hague, and we noted that earlier, but can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there, and both perhaps as an individual case, but also as a singular case of a broader phenomenon of these lawsuits against nations for moving too slowly, or again, trying to hold corporations accountable for climate change? Tell us a bit about how that's working and where you see hope there.
Yeah, so litigation is really kind of a measure of last resort when governments aren't doing their job, when governments are breaking the law, when governments are violating people's human rights. Going to court is expensive, takes a long time, but if that's your last shot at it, then courts can propel transformative changes, as we've seen throughout the course of human history. So in the context of the climate crisis, there are literally thousands of lawsuits around the world, ongoing, some completed, some resulting in revolutionary changes, such as the Dutch Urgenda decision, a case in which civil society succeeded in holding the government of the Netherlands accountable for violating human rights by not doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And subsequently, the government has closed down coal-fired power plants, invested billions of euros in renewable energy, reduced the speed limit on highways, and really, taken the kind of steps that scientists are telling we need to take to address the crisis. The case that was just heard over the last 2 weeks at the International Court of Justice has the potential to be the most important legal proceeding in human history, because the climate crisis, as Claire mentioned, is an existential threat, not just to South Pacific Islanders, but to humanity. I mean, we really are approaching the precipice of tipping points. We don't know where they are, but could be catastrophic. And so this is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. But 5 years ago, a group of law students from the University of South Pacific had this idea that they needed to do something. The conferences with the parties, these endless negotiations that take place annually, are just failing. And it's been 32 years. So I think we can legitimately say that process is broken. So these students had an idea that maybe the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice, could really clarify what the legal obligations of states are in addressing the climate crisis, and the legal consequences if those states are not fulfilling their obligations. And so somewhat miraculously, they persuaded the government of Vanuatu and then a group of other states. To get a case to the International Court of Justice requires a resolution from the UN General Assembly. Last year, they got a unanimous resolution at the UN to bring this case forward. And again, so we just had almost 100 states and about 15 international organizations putting forth legal arguments. And so sometime next year, we'll get this advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which has the potential to change our trajectory, which is both exciting and also somewhat daunting, I'm sure, for those 15 judges to have that weight upon their shoulders.
Yeah. So in this case, it's not a lawsuit. Rather, it's an opinion that could shape thousands of lawsuits that are in progress and to come.
It's an advisory opinion, so it's not legally binding on government, but it's the most authoritative legal body in the world. And what should happen if the International Court of Justice says that wealthy states have an obligation to reduce emissions more quickly, then those states should comply with that guidance. If they don't, then these lawsuits will be used to hold states accountable.
Wow, that's so exciting. I think another thing that I hear a lot from the young people in my circles who have, done degrees or not in environmental matters is we're feeling bad about the outcomes of the COP events and other meetings where we walk away with consensus or sometimes none is reached and then little action seems to follow. So is something like an advisory opinion from the ICJ, could it transform those spaces in giving more the backing to asking and holding accountable the wealthiest nations?
Absolutely. If the advisory opinion comes out and the court accepts the arguments that were made by small island developing states, by countries in the global south, by responsible nations even in the global north, like Portugal and Slovenia, they made very compelling cases to the court about the importance of human rights law and customary international law. There's a law of customary international law that's decades old that says if you're a state that causes significant transboundary harm, you're responsible for A, stopping the activity that causes that harm, and B, compensating the people whom you've harmed, which basic justice, right?
Yeah.
So that is the direction in which we're headed. In terms of the climate negotiation, I want to talk about another thing that's happening that's related to my earlier point about women, and that is the role of youth. And one of the other things I have loved doing for the past 3.5 years is working with a group of some of the smartest young people I've ever met who created a program 3 years ago called the Climate Youth Negotiators Program, because they were youth climate activists who were used to going to these conferences of the parties and protesting and giving speeches, and they realized that the real action in terms of outcomes was happening behind a door that they couldn't open. And so they put together a program to train young people in the dark art of negotiation, got some of the best experts in the world to help them with that training program. They trained 60 young people that first year, and 50 of them, 50 out of 60, were part of national negotiating delegations in Egypt at Sharm el-Sheikh, COP28. It was enormously successful. The next year, they trained 175 young negotiators, all of whom were on national negotiating delegations in Dubai last year. And so you can see where this is headed. The more and more young people in those negotiations will transform the nature of the negotiations. That I'm 100% confident that will happen. And so I think that's another pathway towards changing a system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been fortunate to be in those spaces a few times and to feel a real, actual eyes on you and a deferral to the youth voice and a real respect for, I think, our agency and future interests. I felt very privileged to experience that. And I think it's been a real part of improving the experiences at these conferences and also the optics. I think youth are really good at sharing stories and making sure that pretty critically people are held accountable for what they say that they may do. We're good at the social media game, it would seem.
For sure. And I love your point about stories. So there was a parallel proceeding last week at The Hague called the People's Assembly. And this is another youth-led initiative where they gathered 20 people from frontline communities that are being literally battered by the climate crisis. And they said, let's listen to the voices of these people. And then they took those testimonies. And today, those testimonies were presented to the International Court of Justice. The voices of the people, because inside that courtroom, there was a lot of dry legal argumentation, but today there were photographs of the impacts of cyclones in small island developing states. There were stories told in the voices of people from small island developing states. And there's more power in a story than in 1,000 pages of technical legal mumbo jumbo.
Yeah.
David, we've been mostly talking, insofar as we've been talking about rights, we've mostly been talking about human rights. But another big passion of yours, and one that we share, is about thinking about the rights of nature. So can you tell us a little bit about how this has worked so far in other nations as a precursor for them thinking about how could this work in Canada? I know there's some fledgling efforts, but I'd love to understand more about the opportunities there. So you've got a place that becomes recognized as having environmental personhood, and then where there are appointed trustees, and maybe you can take it over from there.
Yeah, sure. So this concept of nature having rights has deep roots in Indigenous customary law. So while we like to think of it as a new idea, in fact, it's an ancient idea. And because of the growing power of Indigenous peoples around the world, it's an idea that's now popping up literally all over the place. So, you had Ecuador became the first country in the world to recognize the rights of Pachamama, or Mother Earth, in their constitution in 2008. So again, we have now 16 years of experience. What difference does that make? Well, give you one tangible example. So there was a mining company that had got permits to develop a mine in an area of cloud forest known as Los Cedros. And the adjacent community was like, we don't want to mine in Los Cedros. This is a place that's sacred to us, that has incredible biodiversity. And so they filed a lawsuit, which went to the highest level of court in Ecuador. And the court said, allowing mining in the Los Cedros cloud forest would violate the rights of nature and the human right to a healthy environment. So it's an idea that can have tangible outcomes, as well as being something that just is sort of appealing. Like, corporations have rights, municipalities have rights. Nature, which is the life support system on Earth for all species, should have rights if we're serious about protecting nature. And so I think it's a really exciting and promising idea. I think the details vary from country to country. So, in Ecuador, it's constitutional rights of Pachamama. In New Zealand, they're passing specific laws about specific places in which they recognize the legal personhood. So it's a slightly different way of doing it legally. But in New Zealand, they're also, so the laws will designate, for example, a place that used to be known as Te Urewera National Park, a park that was created without even consulting with the Maori people who had been there for hundreds of years. They create a legal person, and then they actually take the crown title, or the government's title, to that land, and they transfer it from the government to that legal person, because a legal person can own land. Mm-hmm. So in other words, Te Urewera, this amazing ecosystem of forests and lakes and mountains, it owns itself. Like, it owns the land. It's like, from a Western legal perspective, this is a mind-blowing idea, but it's taking off. And so I think that's exciting. I do think also, what I'll say, because I'm obsessed with the right to a healthy environment, is that in Latin America, courts and civil society and Indigenous peoples, they don't view humans as separate from nature, right? And we shouldn't. We share DNA with every other living thing on the planet, banana trees, fruit flies. So courts in Latin America are starting to make these really amazing decisions where, for example, there was a tourism mega resort that was going to destroy a mangrove ecosystem in Mexico. And local people fighting that project brought a lawsuit. And the Supreme Court of Mexico said, this project violates the right to a healthy environment for two reasons. Because mangroves are important. They provide a range of ecosystem services that humans depend on. And mangroves are just really important as a part of nature, regardless of whether they have benefits for humans. And so that kind of fusion of the rights of nature and the right to a healthy environment, first of all, it overcomes the long-standing argument that human right to a healthy environment is anthropocentric, when it's actually been used to protect nature for decades. But also, I think it really helps us break down that myth that humans are separate from and superior to nature, when in fact, nature is a community to which we should all be delighted to belong to.
Mm-hmm. Just thinking about the implementation of, I'm imagining community groups and individuals in a Canadian or other context, thinking about how they might use some of these legal tools, right? How would a group say, I'm working with False Creek, the False Creek Friends, if they wanted to have False Creek recognized as an environmental person, just for the sake of argument, how would they go about that?
Yeah, so there's many different ways. They could work with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations to try and have those First Nations pass their own resolution about False Creek having rights on its own. They could work with the city of Vancouver. They could try and get the provincial or federal government. So it can happen at any level. And the examples we're seeing in Canada are that diverse. There's a proposal in Quebec for legislation that would recognize the rights of the St. Lawrence River. There's a really interesting example with respect to the Magpie River in Quebec, where a local Indigenous community and a local municipality passed parallel resolutions to recognize the rights of the Magpie River. We don't know what the legal consequences of that will be. Their long-term concern is that Hydro-Quebec will dam the Magpie River, and whether those resolutions could block a dam is something that only time will tell. And there are a number of First Nations here in British Columbia that are working on rights of nature initiatives, some with local communities, some on their own. The Chilcotin First Nation, which won a major case at the Supreme Court of Canada a decade ago, has passed its own wildlife legislation, which recognizes the rights of wildlife in their territory, dramatically, radically transforming the way that wildlife is conceived of.
To take just the smallest half step to the side here, I liked your earlier point that legal change should be accompanied by cultural awareness and cultural change. And one example of the rights of nature being digested differently that I've saw recently was I heard Grant Wilson from the Earth Law Center speak about nature as a stakeholder in a corporate governance kind of way. So saving a board seat for nature. So it's not only through legal and governance frameworks that we can think of this, but even just building the space out to consider that the obligations that we have as kin to nature, there's room for it in business, in our day-to-day lives, in law, constitutional and otherwise. And it's happening, which is a very feel-good story, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And in fact, you can think of here, one of the most iconic species of the West Coast is the southern resident killer whales. It's incredible population of one of the world's most extraordinary species, deeply endangered by human activities, including removal for aquariums, contamination of ecosystems, and the decline of Chinook salmon. Really, when we do fisheries allocations decisions, it shouldn't be just, here's some fish for Indigenous people, here's some fish for commercial fishermen, and here's some fish for sport fishermen. We should be saying, here's some fish for the southern resident killer whales.
Yeah.
Zooming out now, we've been visiting all kinds of different ideas in this tour of the landscape of rights, nature, and the environment. But zooming out, thinking about after all of these different kinds of engagements that you've had and the bird's eye view of that from your role over the last 6 years on the international stage, what kind of guidance would you have for folks about how they might go about, where there are special opportunities that maybe aren't getting enough attention, where it's a good place for them to think about inserting themselves in building a career?
Yeah, I think two pieces of guidance. One is follow your heart. It's funny, as a lawyer, I haven't made very much money over the course of my career, but I have had an incredibly rewarding career compared to some of my classmates from law school who are multimillionaires, but dissatisfied, unhappy people. So following your heart really is a powerful way to go about your life. And then the other thing is that there's strength in numbers. So it's very difficult to make change as an individual, but if you can find your tribe, and so I encourage people to get involved with local community organizations, volunteer here, volunteer there. I guarantee you'll meet people that will become lifelong friends and allies. And by working together in organizations, we can build the political capital to bring about the changes that we need.
Yeah. So basically, you could intervene anywhere if you did it with enough energy, devotion, and camaraderie.
Yeah, you can intervene anywhere, but do so with a view to changing systems, not just kind of putting lipstick on a peg or tinkering. Yeah. The reality is, I think we shouldn't be too caught up in thinking we have to solve it all by 2030. Yeah. I've been around long enough to remember the turnaround decade, which was the 1990s. David Suzuki ranting that if we didn't fix things by the year 2000, then we were going down the drain. Coming back to what we talked about earlier, that Indigenous view of 7 generations. Not that I think we have 7 generations to address the climate crisis, but taking a bit of the pressure off our shoulders and saying, look, let's move in the right direction as quickly as we can and not beat ourselves up about the fact that we're not going faster. And a little bit of wisdom from Edward Abbey. Have fun while you're doing it. I mean, part of the reason I just love working with the climate youth negotiators, World Youth for Climate Justice, is they have a blast doing what they're doing. And that's something I've forgotten from time to time over the course of my career. But I'm definitely hoping to spend more time working with youth in the years ahead, just because they combine that passion and the vision with understanding that, hey, we're humans. We need to have fun too.
That's why Kosher is oriented towards youth audiences as well.
Yeah. Proud to be from a generation that I think we conceptualize our careers differently than most who came before us. And we're integrating play and liveliness and connection in communities, our personhood and our humanity, sort of the healing that comes along with this work. It's central to all of us. And it's been nice to hear that kind of come up across the episodes. I think that's true as a reflection.
Yeah. I think there's real wisdom to that, Claire. Like the Climate Youth Negotiators program that I've been talking about, when I was in Dubai last year at the climate negotiations, they had a psychologist on as part of their team to help people deal with the stress and the anxiety. They had a table where there was always drinks and snacks where people could just go and take a break from the intensity of it and just sit with friends and kick back. And I just think that's so smart, you know? Yeah. And fun.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, we'll be here for many years to come. And if it's the long game we're playing, then I think taking care of ourselves and others is the way to go about it.
100%.
I think that's where we should wrap it up, David.
Oh, man, it's time to flown by.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us here. We are so inspired by the work that you're doing and just so glad to have you as a colleague. Could not be more proud of what we're doing and what you have done.
Thanks. Listen, it's an honor and a pleasure to be colleagues with you and in relationship with students, and just feel like a super lucky guy.
And now for a short message from one of our conservation allies.
False Creek matters a lot to me just because it allows me and others to really connect with nature, even though we're living in a giant city.
We're fundamentally connected to the water bodies and the surroundings that we're in.
Blue spaces, in particular, are good for our mental and physical health.
Welcome aboard. I'm Zeta, and this is Water Bodies, a podcast from False Creek Friends.
The reality is that False Creek is actually quite alive.
How do we navigate the protection of these places that we love?
What do you imagine False Creek might look like in the next 10 to 20 years?
False Creek can become a beacon and a place to showcase the conservation efforts that are happening throughout the rest of British Columbia.
What it means to be a steward of a land.
Watch, listen, and subscribe to Water Bodies, wherever you get your podcasts. And visit falsecreekfriends.org to learn more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Small Planet Heroes. Small Planet Heroes is a production of CoSphere, a project of the University of British Columbia. UBC is situated on the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. Our guest this week was Dr. David Boyd. Check out our show links in the episode description to learn more about their work and other ongoing projects. Small Planet Heroes was created by our executive producer, Dr. Kai Chan. This episode was edited by Emma Durek-Simard and Anahita Siraji. Production is by me, Sam Blackwell, Maya O'Donnell, Emma Durek-Simard, and Clare Price. Your hosts this week were Dr. Kai Chan and Clare Price. Our show coordinators are Clare Price, Sam Blackwell, Maya O'Donnell, Nancy Kang, and Emma Durek-Simard. Special thanks to Jai Ranganathan, Bilal Bartai, Elizabeth Yee, Katie Kathirson, Nancy Kang, Anahita Siraji, Sarah Klein, and Zeta Schneider. Our theme song was written and performed by Daniel Forrest. Our interviews are conducted and recorded at UBC Studios. If you would like to join our community of Small Planet Heroes, check out cosphere.net.
If you would like to support us, subscribe to our podcast channel, rate the show, and follow us on Instagram at Small Planet Heroes. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it and spread the word. Thank you for listening.